Hello, my name is Brianna McGagan, and I will be giving a literature review today on the minimum wage. So, the first article I want to talk about in this video is The Minimum Wage for Women in Hotels and Restaurants in District of Columbia by Clara Mortensen. The main point of the article really is to, I think, give context as to why we have a minimum wage to begin with, kind of give some history to the origins of it and what its initial intentions are. So some of those are that, for one, the minimum wage was set up and constructed for a very specific group of people. It is to address those marginalized, and so in this case, back in 1920, it was directly concerned with a special group, the unskilled, unorganized women and children workers in the state. Back in 1920, when these conferences were coming together to figure out an appropriate minimum wage, that's what they were striving for, the health of the employees and the protection of their morals. So the data that's given in here is the minimum wage per week that was set up in February of 1920, which is $16.15 a week. And then it also goes down, it goes through and gives how they came up with that amount. So they very meticulously went through and calculated all living expenses that a woman of 1920 would need for 1 year, and then divided it by 52 to come up with a bi-weekly amount allocated. And then the hotel owners also wanted to offer lodging and then therefore take some of that out of their wages, and so they wanted to discuss what was fair with that, and so they agreed that the least sum for which a woman could secure respectable lodging was $3.50 a week. And then also food. So some of the hotel owners and the restaurant owners offered meals for their employers, and they wanted to deduct that from their wages as well. So they agreed that in the same way, if $1 a day or $7 a week was the least sum of which palatable and nutritious food could be obtained, then that's what the restaurant owners and hotel owners could charge. And I think something interesting about that is the adjectives are very subjective. Respectable, palatable, nutritious, those are definitely debatable. So the next article I'll be discussing will be Minimum Wage Increase in the Business Failure Rate by Waltman, McBride, and Camo. So, the main purpose of this article is that they're trying to prove that a minimum wage increase does not necessarily lead to business failure. So that is their goal, and so they do that with a bunch of different data. So they start off actually with they start the article off with the general assumption on, how does minimum wage increase result in business failure rates. And so generally, if labor costs go up, then it is assumed that those businesses are going to have to absorb those costs, that it's going to be so much of a cost, they have to absorb it one way or another, meaning that they have a ton of people who are living under whatever that minimum wage increase is, and they have to close that gap. So if that's the case, then they're going to absorb it in one of three ways. Either all their prices are going to change and increase, and if that's the case, then the side effect is that they might lose customers. The second option is that they decrease their number of laborers. And the side effect for businesses is that they lose in efficiency. The side effect for the general labor force is that our unemployment rate increases. And then the third option is to increase technology and decrease the number of labor, but that requires a lot of capital up front. And then again, same side effects as the second option. So, but they want to see how legitimate all those arguments are, if those are probable cause and effects, or if they're just kind of speculation. So, sets of data that they give us is a summary data, and it just writes it out and explains it for you. It says years with minimum wage increase, and then the mean of number of failures per 10,000 concerns. So years with a minimum wage increase, there were 43.2 businesses of 10,000 that failed. Years with no increase, 50. Years immediately after those in which minimum increase took effect, 48. And years other than years immediately after those in which minimum wage increase took place, 47.6. So what they're showing us with this data is that the highest business failure rate is takes place when there's no minimum wage increase. So I think that's really the point that they're trying to draw here, having on our economy. So then they also give us a couple regression lines. And so basically what they're trying to show us with these graphs is they're correlated a lot smaller than they used to be. So maybe back in the past, a couple decades ago, they were they went 2 and 2, but that might not be the case anymore. So one thing that I would critique this article on is it didn't go into why business rates are dropping if it's not minimum wage. They just tried to disconnect the two. Also, another thing that they didn't talk about was the inflation. It didn't talk about years that we raised minimum wage just to fight back inflation, and fighting back inflation essentially improves businesses and improves competition and helps businesses to continue to be successful. So anyways, I just wish I had hit on either of those topics, and I think that would have added a lot to the article. The next article I'd like to discuss is Minimum Wage Effects on Employment and School Enrollment by David Newmark and William Washer. So the main point of this article is that they are trying to draw possible causation to upward movement in minimum wage and downward movement in enrollment and employment. So basically their theory is that if minimum wage increases, then students who already assume that they're not either A, going on to college, or B, going to become some kind of skilled a skilled part of the labor force, then they're more likely to disenroll from school, drop out of school early, and just jump right into the labor force now. And then the second part of that is that if that's the case, what really happens is employment goes down. So our unemployment rate goes up. Basically, with more students leaving school and joining the labor force, then our labor force increases and jobs don't increase that much. Typically, when minimum wage increases, one of our options, like we talked about in the previous, for the previous article, was that when minimum wage goes up, labor force goes down. So there's already going to be a decline in the labor force, plus there's more laborers to add into the mix, so our unemployment rate actually goes up. So some of the data that they give us is basically simulation data. They're creating their own formulas for what they think, the way teenagers think. So basically how are teenagers coming up with the opportunity costs of staying in school or dropping out of school, or staying in school and becoming employed. So they come up with these different formulas and then generate the results to that formula. I think that sort of research is very limiting because it's built on a lot of speculation. But in their conclusion, they do realize and acknowledge that a lot of it's speculation, and by no means an exact formula. So they do say that whatever the welfare elevation of these changes, the results clearly indicate that focusing solely on the reduced form estimates of minimum wage affects unemployment, masks changes in school enrollment of teenagers, and perhaps also changes in employment that should be of interest to policymakers. So I think really their main point is just, hey, let's talk about this. Let's look at the possible effects that minimum wage could have on our school, on our students' enrollment. And so I think that that's positive. I think that definitely needs to be addressed and should be talked about. And so I think that they did a great job by adding this into the discussion. The fourth article I'd like to talk about is Minimum Wages and Poverty, written by John T. Addison and McKinley L. Blackburn. So I think this is a really great article to add into the conversation because it takes us back to our very first article that we talked about. And basically the writer's point is that they're trying to prove or justify saying that the minimum wage has in fact lowered the poverty rates. A lot of people who are against raising the minimum wage believe that the minimum wage isn't helping who is intended to help, which was the marginalized, the unskilled women and children workers of the labor field.
So some of the data that these writers are using is a little bit different than the data from the previous article about enrollment and employment. In that article, they used a lot of simulation data. Like we talked about, they came up with their own equations and then kind of stimulated what they thought would happen based on those equations. But this article takes a different route. It uses actual, it says, unlike simulation data, our approach relaxes the need to build a restrictive and perhaps unrealistic model in assessing minimum wage effects on poverty. We instead correlated actual changes in poverty with actual changes in the minimum wage. And then interestingly enough, to go back to the article that they used before, they also summarized giving us actual data of what did happen after and before increases. So, for example, between 1983 and 89, with the increase, the dropout rate was 21%, and then without the increase, it was 28%. So, it's a way more reliable way of measuring data using actual events that have happened in our country rather than speculation and simulation.
Finally, the last article I'd like to discuss is Time Series Minimum Wage Studies, a meta-analysis by David Carr and Alan B. Kruger.
So in this last article, one of the things I think is really interesting is they don't necessarily give a clear point on what side they're on when it comes to minimum wage. Are they for raising it? Are they for not raising it? But they do discuss the validity of the research that is presented by those who are in favor of, or are not in favor of raising it. So basically it starts off with saying one of the best known predictions of standard economic theory is that an increase in minimum wage will lower employment of low-wage workers, right? Most of the data that is available that is in support of this assumption is based off of time series studies. And so he wants to go into the validity of time series studies. And so basically they say it is important to assess the validity of time series estimates. In this paper, they want to present a meta-analysis of the published time series literature. So the writers of this last article are concerned with that the presumption of this effective minimum wage leads to two sources of publication bias. So first, the reviewers and the editors are predisposed towards accepting papers that show a significant negative effect of the minimum wage. And so that bias in itself is only producing so many arguments on the minimum wage that fit this criteria. And so what that's doing is it's forcing researchers who need to be published to create data that fits the publisher's expectations, and that is already just skewing our resources and are just going to add to the preconceived notion of minimum wage.
Thank you for watching, and I hope this video was informative on the research available on the minimum wage.